They told you this would never happen. Every analyst, every diplomat, every defense secretary who ever sat behind a podium and assured the world that America's commitment to NATO was ironclad, unconditional, and permanent. They were all wrong because 3 days ago, something happened inside Washington that every European government had privately feared for years and publicly dismissed as impossible. Trump didn't threaten NATO. He didn't renegotiate NATO. He didn't send another angry tweet about burden sharing or wave the 2% GDP threshold like a weapon at a summit. He did something far more permanent, far more surgical, far more devastating. He signed a directive that doesn't just weaken the most powerful military alliance in human history. It hollows it out from the inside and leaves the shell standing so nobody panics until it's already too late. Europe woke up this week in a world it has never lived in before, and the clock that just started ticking has no reset button. To understand what Trump just did and why every government from Warsaw to Paris is now operating in crisis mode, you have to start with one number: 70%. That is the share of NATO's total military capability that comes directly from the United States. Not a plurality, not a majority, 70%. That includes the nuclear umbrella that has kept Russian missiles off European cities for 7 decades. It includes the satellite intelligence networks that tell European commanders where threats are moving before those threats even know they've been spotted. It includes the F-35 air superiority platforms, the Aegis ballistic missile defense systems, and the carrier strike groups that have patrolled the Atlantic and Mediterranean like a permanent visible warning to anyone considering a move against a NATO member. Every war game, every classified simulation, every scenario that European defense planners have run on the question of what happens if America leaves produces the same result. The results are never published. The reason they are never published is that the outcome is catastrophic every single time. That is the alliance Trump just gutted, and he did it in 4 pages. The directive Trump signed does not use careful language. It does not talk about reform or restructuring or a new framework for burden-sharing conversations. It uses one word repeated across those 4 pages with a consistency that leaves no room for interpretation: withdrawal. But here is where it gets more dangerous than the headlines are capturing. Because Trump's legal team did not simply walk America out of the front door of NATO. They found something more precise, something that achieves the same outcome while keeping the legal structure technically intact, leaving Europe with no mechanism to fight back and no international tribunal with jurisdiction to hear the case. The United States' participation in NATO rests on the North Atlantic Treaty of 1949, ratified by the Senate. A president cannot unilaterally withdraw from a Senate-ratified treaty. That constitutional firewall is what NATO's defenders have repeated for 2 years as the reason this day would never come. Trump's lawyers went around it. The directive does not formally exit the treaty. What it does instead is suspend American operational commitments under Article 5, redirect American military assets away from NATO command structures, defund American contributions to the alliance's joint budget, and reclassify every American military presence in Europe from an alliance obligation into a bilateral commercial arrangement subject to renegotiation on American terms. The treaty remains on paper. The alliance it was written to govern is operationally dead. It is the legal equivalent of removing every load-bearing wall from a building while leaving the facade standing so nobody sees the collapse coming until they're already inside when it happens. European legal teams worked through the night searching for a response mechanism and found almost nothing. The North Atlantic Treaty has no enforcement clause for member state compliance. There is no court with jurisdiction over this. There is no procedure to compel American participation. The architects of that treaty in 1949 never wrote one because the assumption embedded in every article, every clause, every paragraph of that document was that American leadership of the alliance was permanent. That assumption was not a policy position. It was the invisible foundation that the entire structure sat on, and Trump just pulled it out. What makes this moment genuinely different from every previous Trump threat against NATO is that this one did not come from nowhere. The signals were accumulating for months, and when you line them up in sequence, what looked like political chaos starts to look like something engineered in deliberate stages with bureaucratic precision. And it started in February. Trump delivered a new defense spending threshold to European NATO members. Not through a formal summit communique, not through diplomatic back channels, but directly in a bilateral meeting with the German Chancellor with no softening and no negotiating room built in. The number was 5% of GDP. No European nation currently meets that threshold. Not one. For Germany alone, reaching 5% would require increasing its defense budget by 180 billion euros every single year. That is not a target. That is a trap designed to be rejected. giving the administration a documented record of European noncompliance to justify every step that followed. Then came March. The United States quietly suspended the sharing of certain satellite reconnaissance data with 4 European NATO partners. There was no public announcement, no press conference, no formal notification through alliance channels. European military commanders discovered the gap themselves when they began noticing holes in their battlefield intelligence picture during joint exercises in Poland. When they asked American counterparts what had happened, the answer they received was 4 words: pending policy review. Those 4 words were never resolved. The data was never restored. 4 words that told every European defense planner paying attention exactly where things were heading months before Trump ever signed anything. Then came April. American diplomatic teams made quiet visits to Warsaw, Tallinn, Bucharest, and Helsinki. These were not routine alliance consultations. They were not scheduled summits or bilateral defense reviews. They were structured as private commercial conversations about what a post-NATO bilateral security arrangement might look like, what American military capabilities might remain available, and at what price, under what conditions, and on whose terms. The governments that received those visits did not go public immediately. Some still haven't. But 3 separate diplomatic sources with direct knowledge of those meetings have confirmed the same core message delivered in each capital. The Trump administration was not exploring ways to reform NATO. It was preparing European governments for NATO's end and presenting them with an alternative built entirely around American leverage. By the time the directive was signed, the groundwork was already laid across an entire continent. This was not impulsive. This was not a negotiating tactic that went too far. This was a dismantling that had been sequenced across months, executed with the kind of bureaucratic precision that does not happen by accident, and delivered to Europe not as an opening position, but as a finished fact. And the question that nobody in Brussels had a prepared answer for when that document hit the wire is the same question now driving every emergency session, every closed-door meeting, and every frantic call between defense ministers happening across Europe right now. If America has already gutted the alliance from the inside without technically leaving it, and if the legal architecture gives Europe no mechanism to stop it or reverse it, then what exactly are they supposed to do next? The answer that European governments are quietly arriving at behind closed doors is the one that changes everything. And it is far more dangerous than anything Trump's directive actually says. The emergency session of the European Council convened within 18 hours of Trump's directive hitting the wire. Heads of state were pulled from domestic schedules, flights were arranged on short notice, and Brussels filled with the kind of quiet, controlled urgency that career diplomats recognize immediately as genuine panic wearing a professional mask. The public statement released after that session was 4 sentences long, measured, vague, deliberately non-committal. It spoke of ongoing consultations and reaffirmed European commitments to collective security. It said nothing about what actually happened inside that room. Because what happened inside that room was not unity, it was not resolve. It was the complete and open fracturing of the European political consensus that has held the alliance together from the European side for 3 decades, happening faster and more completely than any Russian strategic planner could have engineered if they had tried. France and Germany could not agree on a unified response. Poland refused to sign the joint communiqué in its original form. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania submitted a separate minority statement that directly contradicted the main document's tone. And Hungary's Viktor Orban did not attend at all. He sent a deputy who said nothing and signed nothing. The image of European unity that Brussels has spent years carefully constructing for public consumption collapsed in a single session. The cracks that alliance diplomacy had plastered over for decades were suddenly visible all at once. And every government in that room knew that the cameras waiting outside would never be shown what the room actually looked like. Macron moved first because Macron always moves first when he senses a vacuum opening. Within hours of the emergency session ending, the French president convened a separate bilateral call with the leaders of Poland, Romania, and the 3 Baltic states. The subject of that call, according to officials briefed on its contents, was Article 42.7 of the EU Treaty, the mutual defense clause that European federalists have spent years quietly positioning as a potential structural replacement for NATO's Article 5. Macron has been building toward this moment for 7 years. His 2019 declaration that NATO was experiencing brain death was not a diplomatic blunder. It was a strategic signal. France announcing early that it intended to be the architect of whatever came after. Now that after has arrived, Macron is moving with a speed and precision that tells you the plans were not drafted last week. French military staff have already been in contact with European counterparts about a new command structure centered in Paris. French nuclear doctrine, which has always remained deliberately outside NATO's integrated command, suddenly looks less like a historical quirk inherited from Charles de Gaulle and more like a calculated strategic reserve kept separate for exactly this contingency. But the problem at the center of Macron's plan is so fundamental that French defense analysts are fighting about it in classified sessions right now, and it does not have a clean answer. France's nuclear deterrent covers France. It has never been formally extended to Poland. It has never been formally extended to Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania. And the governments in Warsaw, Tallinn, Riga, and Vilnius understand that distinction with a precision that comes from geography, from history, and from sharing a land border with Russia. A French nuclear umbrella that protects Paris is not the same thing as an American nuclear umbrella that has covered the entire continent for 75 years. Every Eastern European government in that emergency session knows the difference, and the ones closest to the Russian border are not prepared to stake their national survival on Macron's ambitions. Poland is now the axis on which this entire crisis turns. No European nation has invested more deliberately in its own defense over the last decade. No European nation has cultivated its bilateral relationship with Washington more carefully or more consistently. Polish strategic doctrine, shaped by centuries of invasion from both East and West, has always operated on one foundational principle. Multilateral guarantees are only as reliable as the most powerful nation willing to enforce them. Poland spent years making itself indispensable to American strategy on the continent precisely because Warsaw never fully trusted that the collective guarantee alone was enough. That calculation has just been validated in the most painful way possible. Poland currently hosts American troops, American equipment, and American missile defense infrastructure on its territory. Under Trump's directive, every one of those assets is now legally reclassified as a bilateral commercial arrangement subject to renegotiation. Polish defense officials spent last night running the numbers on what it would cost to convert those arrangements into paid contracts under the new American framework. The figure they arrived at exceeded Poland's entire annual defense budget by a factor of 3. Poland cannot afford to keep what it already has on its own soil. And without American assets in place, the 800-kilometer border Poland shares with Belarus and the Kaliningrad exclave, Russian territory where Iskander ballistic missiles sit capable of reaching Berlin in under 4 minutes, becomes the most dangerously exposed frontier anywhere in Europe. Germany's response has done more political damage than Germany's silence ever could have. The new German government, still assembling its coalition after February's election, does not have a functioning defense ministry at full operational capacity. The chancellor issued a statement expressing grave concern. The statement contained no military commitments, no financial figures, and no concrete timeline for any action of any kind. This is the same Germany that NATO spent 20 years pressuring to take defense spending seriously. The same Germany that only crossed the 2% GDP threshold after Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine in 2022, and only then under sustained Allied pressure. Now, in the single most consequential moment for European security since the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany's answer to the collapse of the American security guarantee is a press release. European partners who have watched German defense policy for decades are not surprised. They are simply watching, confirmed in real time, what they have privately believed for years. When the American umbrella disappears, Germany will not step forward to fill the space it leaves. Germany will negotiate with whatever power moves into that space. Instead, the Baltic states have already moved to a different calculation entirely. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have activated reserve military call-ups, accelerated ammunition movements to forward positions, and placed National Guard structures on heightened operational alert. These are not symbolic gestures designed for cameras. These are the specific operational steps that Baltic military doctrine prescribes for the scenario of NATO dissolution, steps that have been written, rehearsed, and kept ready precisely because Baltic strategic culture has never fully believed the American commitment was truly unconditional. 50 years of Soviet occupation that the West watched happen and did not reverse until 1991, left a specific kind of institutional memory in those three governments. They planned for betrayal not because they expected it, but because they could not afford to be wrong if it came. It came, and somewhere in Moscow, in the quiet offices where Russian strategic planners do their most careful and most consequential work, someone is looking at Baltic mobilization, German paralysis, French ambition without reach, and Polish bankruptcy staring at its own border. And they are not seeing a crisis. They are seeing a map, And the question that should be keeping every European leader awake tonight is not whether Russia sees the opportunity. It is whether Europe has any viable way to close it before someone in the Kremlin decides the window is open wide enough to move through. Because the answer European defense ministries are arriving at when they run that calculation is the answer that changes not just European security, but the entire global order. And it is not the answer anyone in Brussels was hoping for. The world that existed 1 week ago is not wounded. It is not reforming. It is gone. What Trump's directive has accomplished is not the weakening of an alliance or the opening of a renegotiation. It is the demolition of the single foundational assumption upon which every European government has built its security architecture, its economic planning, and its political legitimacy since 1949. That assumption was not complicated. It was 4 words: America does not leave. Every defense budget calculated on that assumption is now built on sand. Every deterrent strategy constructed around the American nuclear umbrella is now a document describing something that no longer exists. Every diplomatic framework designed around the guarantee of American military presence is now worthless paper dressed in official letterhead. The financial markets did not wait for politicians to find the right words. The euro dropped to its lowest point against the dollar in 11 years during overnight trading. Italian bond yields crossed 8%, the exact threshold that in 2011 nearly shattered the eurozone entirely. European defense stocks surged while every broader index collapsed because investors understand with cold arithmetic what elected officials are still struggling to say out loud in public. Europe is about to spend money it does not have on capabilities, it cannot build fast enough to replace a security architecture, it cannot reconstruct alone against a timeline it does not control. Inside NATO headquarters in Brussels this morning, the corridors look identical to how they looked last week. Same flags, same nameplates, same schedules on the calendar, but the people walking those corridors know what the building is now. The command structures exist on paper. The joint exercises remain scheduled. The press releases will keep being issued with the correct formatting and the correct signatures. But the core, the American military power, the nuclear deterrence, the intelligence backbone, the logistical infrastructure that made every NATO guarantee credible has been removed. What remains is not an alliance. It is a monument, a very official, very expensive monument to something that used to exist and no longer does. And somewhere in Moscow tonight, someone already marked today's date, not as a warning, not as a concern, but as an opportunity. The only question left is whether Europe figures out its next move before Russia makes theirs.